From Interfaith Alliance, this is The State of Belief. I'm Interfaith Alliance President, Reverend Paul Brandeis Raushenbush in New York City. The names we're hearing for key positions in the incoming administration have alarmed a lot of Americans. Among the reasons for concern, the Christian nationalist history of several of them. This week, religion scholar Matthew Taylor is back with his expert take on the likely game plan and the role of politicized religion for the next 4 years. Bad Faith is a powerful documentary film tracing the history of the movement we now call Christian nationalism. With dozens of experts, it traces the history of spreading fear and anger and distorting political issues into biblical battles between good and evil, with American democracy as the biggest casualty. This week, I'll be talking to director Stephen Ujlaki and executive producer Todd Stiefel. We need these conversations now more than ever. If religion and democracy is something you care about, then make sure you subscribe, share, and rate the State of Belief podcast at Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform. Let's help more people learn how religion can be a bridge, not a bludgeon. And by joining in, that you will feel that we are together and less alone and that we can show up for one another in this critical time. Our library is filled with conversations like this one with kind of everyone in the religion space that really needs to be heard right now. So I encourage you to go to our website, stateofbelief.com, and see all of the different conversations and listen to them for inspiration and hope right now. You can help grow the State of Belief with a financial contribution, and you can also do that at stateofbelief.com. Before we get started, here's something I want to get on your radar. Promise 2025. We're hearing a lot today about all the things that we are up against this difficult moment in American democracy, but I want you to know that Interfaith Alliance is developing a strategy on how to hold the line, and it's called Promise 2025. So I hope you'll come to interfaithalliance.org, look at what we're doing. There's a webinar coming up that can talk a little bit more about what we're doing, but I just want to invite you all to recognize there is something that each of us can do and must do as we approach this next months, years of the Trump administration, and do what we can to preserve American democracy. Consider this your invitation to join with us to do that important work. And now to my first guest. Dr. Matthew D. Taylor is a scholar of religion specializing in American religious movements, evangelical Christianity, and Islamic Christian relations. He holds a PhD in theology and religious studies from Georgetown University and is currently a senior scholar at the Institute for Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Studies. Matt is widely recognized for his research on Christian nationalism and the New Apostolic Reformation, and his new book, The Violent Take It by Force, The Christian Movement That Is Threatening Our Democracy, sounded warnings that are quickly playing out since the recent election. When I saw some of the names put forward by the incoming administration, in particular Fox News weekend host Pete Hegseth, I knew right away that I needed to have Dr. Taylor back on the show. And so, Matthew Taylor, welcome back to the State of Belief.
Thank you for having me back here, Paul. I wish it was under better circumstances, but I'm glad to be back.
Oh my goodness! Well, you know what? This is the moment. I mean, your work, your research, all of what you set up before the election with your amazing book, which I was telling everyone about, The Violent Take It by Force, the Christian movement that is threatening our democracy. All of that played out. I mean, unfortunately, and so here we are. Let's just start by just asking you, when you were looking at the returns and then when you were able to, over the few days following the election, did you see trends that reflected what you had been looking at as far as the role of Christian nationalism and some of these players? Did you see that play out in this election? Were there surprises, or were you like, oh, yeah, of course that's what happened?
There definitely were surprises. I was not expecting the assassination attempts on Trump, and I think that those actually, in the long run, helped him quite a bit in terms of consolidating some of the kind of Christian nationalist sentiment around him. A lot of Christians read those assassination attempts as signs from God, that God's favor was on Trump and God was protecting Trump. And then if you were paying attention right at the very end of the campaign in October, really, there was a real strong push from some of these Christian nationalist groups that I keep an eye on. There were multiple events on the National Mall trying to gather and galvanize Christians around the election. I maintain that if Trump had lost, if he had been declared the loser, there would have been an attempt to overturn this election. His campaign, his allies were really geared up for that, and many of the Christian nationalist leaders that I monitor were very much geared up for a repeat of something like January 6th, if not something worse. But if you notice as well, there were a number of events right in the kind of like last week and a half before the election where Trump was gathering, especially with religious leaders and especially Christian leaders. And I think that one of the brilliant things that and it's not so much a brilliance of the Trump campaign, it's a brilliance of the religious right overall, is that over the last 40, 50 years, they have really built an infrastructure for using religious leaders to access their congregations, access their influence networks. And they really tapped into that in this election. I mean, the Trump campaign was not spending very much money on get out the vote. They really farmed it out to groups like Turning Point USA, which has very strong Christian nationalist roots today, to groups like Lance Wallnau's Courage Tour, to Elon Musk's networks. So there was this kind of diffusion of the get out the vote effort. And a lot of that was being done by these religiously aligned groups. And I think it was a very effective strategy. And I think there was also an effective strategy of reaching out to Christians of color, which I think the Trump campaign realized they had maxed out their share of the white Christian vote. But by my observations, both anecdotally and if you look at the exit polls, it sure seems like they made real inroads, especially with Latino Christians.
Yeah. Yeah, I had a chance to talk to Catherine Stewart after the election, and she was like, you can bus all the people into Pennsylvania you want from New York, knocking on doors, strangers. It's nothing compared to like a Christian network where you have these trusted messengers who are saying, get out the vote. And, the fact that you're not supposed to do that, like they don't, that is just, not something they pay attention to at all, and so, right. I mean, so this, this really strong network, and then reinforced by an incredible media universe that is like at every day just making the stakes clear. One of the things that I saw you write about was we had talked about Trump as a Cyrus figure, but then there was a shift into you talk about it was your analysis. So what was the shift? First of all, what did Cyrus, for those who might not have heard you the last time on the show, what did Cyrus represent in the Bible as Trump? But then who did he turn into?
Yeah, so and the Cyrus connection with Trump actually, I mean, almost as soon as Trump enters presidential politics. So he comes into the presidential race, like the Republican kind of primary in June of 2015. In July of 2015, a charismatic prophet issues this prophecy connecting Donald Trump to Cyrus. And right. Cyrus, if you go back in your Hebrew Bible history, so the Jewish people get conquered by the Babylonian Empire, taken into exile in Babylon, and then the Persian Empire conquers the Babylonian Empire, and Cyrus is the emperor of the Persians who sends the Jewish people. I mean, this was Cyrus's policy overall, was he was trying not to do like displace and dislocate people groups the way the Babylonians had, and so he sends the Jewish people back to rebuild Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. And in Isaiah chapter 45, where the prophet Isaiah is reflecting on this kind of mystery that this heathen ruler could play such a pivotal role in delivering the people of God, refers to Cyrus as the anointed of God. And that term anointed is in Hebrew is Mashiach. It's where we get the term Messiah. And so this analogy or this comparison of Trump to Cyrus, and they would even say that it's not merely an analogy, it's a typology, right? It's that Trump kind of mimics or mirrors Cyrus. And so the idea was Trump is this outsider, right? He's not a conventional politician. He's not a conventional Christian, but he's this outsider that God can use as an instrument to deliver God's people, i.e. conservative Christians in this interpretation. And so this has been an ongoing analogy. This was a major reason that evangelicals got on board with voting for Trump in 2016. This was one of the major theological rationales. Right. You could argue that it was kind of crass politics that drew them to Trump, but this was the way that they rationalized it theologically, was saying, right, hey, he's not a good man, but he's God's man, right? And that's carried through. That there still are people who will talk about the Cyrus thing, but I noticed, especially once Harris entered the race, this other biblical metaphor really rose to the surface and became the dominant metaphor in some of these prophecy circles. And in order to understand this one, you have to understand that the name Jezebel in charismatic circles carries a very strong negative connotation. Jezebel in the Hebrew Bible is this, she's a wicked queen, right? She's an evil queen who persecutes the godly people in the Hebrew Bible narrative. And so in this analogy, they're comparing Trump to a king named Jehu, who's responsible for killing Jezebel. And so the way that they would use the analogy is they would say that Kamala Harris is a type of a Jezebel. And in these charismatic circles, they'll often talk about the spirit of Jezebel as kind of an embodiment of evil, it kind of carries connotations of feminism, of malign sexuality, of LGBTQ rights, of abortion. All these things kind of get lumped together under this kind of Jezebel thing. So they directly targeted and said Kamala Harris is a Jezebel, which, if you know anything about the racial history of this term, right, directing that at a black woman, it was a very kind of loaded metaphor. But but then when they compare Trump to Jehu in the story, Jezebel's married to King Ahab, who's also seen as this very wicked ruler. Ahab dies, and Jehu is anointed king after Ahab's death, but Jezebel's still alive. And so in the story, and this is 2 Kings 9 and 10, the Jehu finds where Jezebel's hiding out. She's up in this high tower with her servants. He rides up with his commanders on their horses, and he commands her servants to throw her out of this tower. And they do. And she hits the ground and dies, and her blood splatters on their horses. And then he proceeds to trample her corpse with his horse. And then wild dogs come and eat her body. And the message of this story is that Jezebel is such a profane figure. She's so vile that she has to be reduced to dog feces, that all memory of her has to be eradicated. And this is the imagery that they're using. They're saying Donald Trump is a Jehu, Kamala Harris is a Jezebel, and they're prophesying in this election, Jezebel will be cast out or cast down, right? So they're literally using this image of the execution of Jezebel. This is this very violent, visceral, ugly biblical image that I think actually does reflect Trump's rhetoric as well, right? In 2016, Trump's the outsider, and it's these outside threats. It's migrants, and it's China, and it's unfair trade practices, it's NATO, it's all these external things. But now the enemy is internal, right? And now it's the enemy within. Right. And so they've changed their biblical metaphor, but now it's justifying not Trump as the ruler God is anointed, but Trump as the violent figure that they want to embrace his violence. And it's very, very ugly.
It is. I mean, I remember Jezebel coming up, and I don't actually remember who was saying it. I don't think, did Trump ever say it? I'm not sure he ever said it, but there were definitely, it was being used. Oh yeah. After the debate, they were calling her Jezebel because she tricked Donald Trump. And, so, it's really disgusting. I mean, like hearing you lay it out like that, it I feel really like it makes me sick. And it really makes me angry.
And Paul, just if that makes you angry, just like a few days before the election, Trump was gathered with his faith advisors, and it was this gathering in Florida with a bunch of his faith advisors. And one of these figures named Jonathan Cahn, he's a Messianic rabbi. He gets up and issues this prophecy, like a 3-minute prophecy over Trump, where he says, you are destined to follow the template of Jehu. Right? It's not like, oh, here's an interesting analogy. And then he goes on to say, Jehu drained the swamp in his capital city. And that's not merely referring to the death of Jezebel. After Jehu just annihilates Jezebel, he goes on a killing rampage and slaughters Ahab and Jezebel's family, piles their children's heads up at the city gates, slaughters anyone who's affiliated and associated with them. So when they're talking about draining the swamp and the template of Jehu, they are conditioning their Christian followers to endorse and embrace Donald Trump's violence and to say that that's just part of the script. That's what he has to follow, right? And so it was such a fascistic theology that was being promoted at the very end of this campaign to say Donald Trump is righteous no matter how violent he gets.
Yeah, now I feel sicker. Thanks. That's great.
Yeah.
Well done.
You're welcome.
Well done. And now let's talk about Pete Hegseth. I mean, here's the thing. Like, it's very, this is not 2016. We're like, I wonder what's going to happen. Like, we know it. He's told us what was going to happen, and now it's happening. And there's a few, there's a few, maybe all, but there's lots of problematic figures. Hegseth is a maybe singular in his problematicness. This is a Fox News correspondent who is now being put up for Secretary of Defense, I think.
Yes.
And why don't you lay out a little bit about how you understand Pete Hegseth? Because you probably have a pretty good insight into where he's coming from, given your own research, and he's someone familiar to you. So let's talk about Pete. This is pretty serious, and it's going to be serious over the next several weeks. And I think it's really important that this guy gets exposed for the serious Christo-fascist that he is.
Yeah, so just as a piece of background knowledge, I think that really helps to contextualize and understand who Pete Hegseth is. I study the Christian far right, and in the Christian far right, in these circles, in these kind of theological circles, these discussion circles, there's a lot of valorization of the Crusades. And so part of the idea is that the Crusades are seen as kind of exemplifying a sort of clash of civilizations, a clash between Islam and the quote-unquote West, or the Judeo-Christian civilization. And so there's this kind of valorization, this appropriation of the Crusades in many of these kind of far-right circles, the symbolism, the rhetoric of the Crusades. So when I looked into Pete Hegseth, and because some people asked me kind of if he had ties into some of this far-right Christian world, I dug for just a couple hours looking at him, and there's all kinds of evidence of his immersion in this kind of neo-crusader discourse. So he's very close to a couple of pastors in Tennessee that he attends their church, and this is part of the CREC. It's a denomination of the far right Calvinist denomination, what we would call a Reformed denomination. And this is a group that endorses this denomination, and the theologians within it endorse ideas like theonomy, applying biblical law to modern societies. They like the idea of talking about a new Christendom, right? And Christendom is the physical territory that Christian rulers rule over, right? And so the idea of the Crusades is it's an expansion of Christendom. And in the legend of the Crusades, because we don't have detailed historical accounts, but in the legends of the Crusades, Pope Urban II in 1095 gathers a group of church leaders at the Council of Clermont and declares the need for Christians to go and take back the Holy Land, take back the Eastern Mediterranean, because it's Jesus's country, right? It's where Jesus walked, and these infidels, the Muslims, are ruling over. I mean, at this point, the Muslims have been ruling over for like 300 years, so it's not exactly news, right? But he's saying, no, we as Christians need to take this back. And according to the legends, after he kind of declares and preaches this sermon, the whole crowd echoes back, Deus vult, which means God wills it, God wills it. And this becomes a sort of slogan of the Crusades, that this violence is not merely at the instigation of the Pope, it's not merely in response to Islam, but it is the will of God for Christians to go and slaughter Muslims. And this is what Pete Hegseth has tattooed on his arm. He has Deus Vult tattooed on his arm. This is a slogan that we even saw on January 6th, along with Crusader symbolism. And on his bicep, on his chest, he has the Jerusalem cross. So when the Crusaders come and conquer Jerusalem, they slaughter most of the people in the city. And the Crusader accounts themselves, the accounts they write describe blood flowing up to their ankles in the city of Jerusalem. And then they, as they're still spattered in the blood of their enemies, they go and worship Jesus in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and on the Temple Mount. And then once they've conquered Jerusalem, they establish the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem that lasts for about 100 years, where European Christian powers hold control over Jerusalem. And that's the symbol that he has on his chest as well. And then he wrote a book called American Crusade, where he talks about, this was in 2020, he talks about valorizing the Crusades, how we need to be Crusaders now, we need to fight back against Muslims. So there's a theme of Islamophobia, of violent aggression towards Muslims, but this is a very far right ideology. I mean, to the point where, because those tattoos, when Pete Hegseth's National Guard unit was called up for Joe Biden's inauguration, right, 2 weeks after January 6th, his unit got called up because they had to protect the capital city. People in his unit flagged and said, I'm not sure he should be serving right now. He's got extremist tattoos. And the army had to investigate and say, yeah, okay, we probably should not let him be on protecting our capital city in the aftermath of January 6th.
Was he actually removed?
Yeah, he was blocked from serving with his National Guard unit. Him personally, and a few other members who had these extremist tattoos.
That's shocking. Yeah. I mean, that's like that. I mean, okay. I mean, all of this should be disqualifying, because this is like not. It doesn't represent. How can you represent the symbol of national defense if you are so out of step? But this is who Trump puts forward. So I just think it's like but what we have to do right now is we have to let the American people know about this. Yes. And of course there's some American people who are going to be like, yeah, awesome. But that is, we have to just hope that will not be the majority. That there'll be people who are really, the fact that he was removed from his squadron or troop or whatever, because he was too radical to defend the Capitol.
Yes.
This should, it's unbelievable. So, this is really important information. And I don't know, like there's almost he's not the only one who's could be tied to Christian nationalism among the those who have been presented as cabinet members or other parts of his administration. Certainly there are others. So I don't know, I'm curious, for you as someone who's so steeped in this, what are you hearing among your colleagues in the religion? You were just at the American Academy of Religion. What's the sense among those who are really studying religion? What moment are we in? I mean, what was the sense of the Academy about this moment?
I mean, I was gathered with about 10,000 religion scholars in San Diego this past weekend, and as religion scholars, we're trained in pattern recognition. We're trained in kind of observing these historical connections and patterns, and you don't have to stretch very far to see analogs to what's going on in the United States today around the rest of the world, right? I mean, and when we talk about Christian nationalism, sometimes we can get very myopic and think, oh, this is an American thing or this is a Christian thing. Religious nationalism is a thing across the board. I mean, right? There's Islamism, there's Buddhist nationalism, there's Hindu nationalism, there's religious Zionism. I mean, there's all kinds of forms of religious nationalism in the world, and it often gets attached to these kind of populist authoritarian leaders. In the form of, say, Recep Tayyip Erdogan in Turkey, or Narendra Modi in India, or Viktor Orban in Hungary, or Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, right? There's a ongoing pattern of these far right populist authoritarian movements appropriating kind of religious nationalist tropes to rise to power and then to change these societies, to restructure these societies. And so, the people I talk to who are dialed in and watching this stuff are extremely concerned about what comes next, extremely concerned about the fact that Trump has basically carte blanche to run his agenda. He functionally controls all three branches of the U.S. government. There aren't really many checks and balances left to block him. There were a lot of norms that we were counting on in the first administration, but I think we realized those norms are not walls, they're speed bumps, right? And Trump has kind of trampled all over the norms that kept many previous presidents in check. So I think we're very concerned, and I also just think we need to be attentive to the fact that part of the playbook when a populist authoritarian like Trump comes to power is that they start to change the system of government, moving it more away from liberal democracy, liberal with a lowercase l, right, in terms of liberty and protections for the individual, rule of law, freedom of speech, all these sorts of things, moving it away from that into what we would call an illiberal democracy, one where it's often more of a one-party rule, where there might be kind of a veneer of democracy, kind of, okay, we'll have elections, right? But there are elections in Russia. It's just if you run against Vladimir Putin, you'll probably end up dead, right? So I'm not saying that that's necessarily what's in the immediate future for us, but there are a lot of levers a party in power, especially one that doesn't adhere to principles and norms, can pull, that can start to rig the system against other parties, against any competitors. And Trump has promised retribution on his enemies. He's promised a campaign of vengeance. I mean, if Trump fulfills even a third of what he promised in this campaign, it would radically restructure American society in a very, very dangerous and deleterious direction.
Yeah, I think that you've laid it out. I'm curious. You are in some ways a product not of this movement. I'm not doing that, but if a few things had not happened, you could imagine yourself almost like being like a true believer, in this kind of ideology. And I'm just wondering, like, what are in your mind, what are the levers that are for those of us who believe in a multi-religious, multiracial liberal democracy? What do you think are the levers, specifically for those of us who are kind of functioning within the religion realm? What do you think we should be doing? What's the, the kind of organization I run, Interfaith Alliance, we're around the country. We're talking to people, all of whom are very disturbed by what we're seeing right now. What should we be doing?
Well, so I think what we saw in the first Trump administration is that litigation can be very, very helpful in kind of at least slowing the march of some of this stuff. And I think we're going to need a lot of Christian lawyers. We're going to need a lot of Christian organizations filing amicus briefs, participating in and protecting the victims of a lot of Trump's worst impulses. The theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who himself was very important in resisting Nazism, has this very interesting kind of delineation of how the church, or you could extend it to religious organizations as a whole, can relate to the state, especially a state that's becoming authoritarian. And he says there's three different ways. One is that you can hold the mirror up to the state to show what's actually going on, right? And I think we really need that right now, where the Trump administration is going to be characterized by just a panoply of disinformation, right? Where it's just going to be, they're just going to flood the zone with chaos and chaff and just try to distract us from things. I think Christians and religious people of conviction need to hold up the mirror. The second way that Bonhoeffer talks about is you can care for the victims of the state, right? Where the victims of the state, and he even uses the image of the state kind of as a cart that's crushing people under its wheels, right? And part of the role of religious organizations is to care for the migrants, to care for the refugees, to care for the people of color, the LGBTQ individuals, right? The people who are going to be on the front lines of receiving the aggression of the second Trump administration. And this is, Bonhoeffer makes a third case, and this is, I think, the one that we maybe need to get our heads and our hearts around a little bit more. And that is, he says, at some point, the church or religious individuals might not be sufficient to simply care for the victims of the state. Maybe you need to throw something into the spokes of the wheel, to stop the state. Right. And ultimately, Bonhoeffer himself participated in an assassination attempt on Hitler. And so I'm not saying that, again, I'm not saying we've gotten there yet. And I think we need to always be kind of measured and cautious. And I would not at all advocate violence by any religious organizations. But I do think that we're coming to a time where some of the things that Donald Trump has promised and threatened in this campaign are very serious violations of human rights. And I think we need to get ready to stand and be courageous and protest and not merely let this stuff proceed as though this is just business as usual or, they're so strong that we just have to kowtow. I think part of the role of religious communities is to have principle, to have conscience, to have conviction, and to stand firm in the midst of a society where principles and conviction are being thrown out the door in favor of the naked pursuit of power.
Thank you for that. That is an excellent summation of Bonhoeffer's, offerings. And I think each one of them are important work for those of us who are in this moment and determined to preserve our democracy should take into account. As long as we mentioned Bonhoeffer, have you been following the controversy around the latest film and the 80 members of Bonhoeffer's family who have said to Eric Metaxas, like, stop abusing the memory of of Dietrich Bonhoeffer? Have you been following that? I don't know if any of that came up at AAR or in any of your conversations, but I do think it's very interesting. I mean, this is like a very neat trick to take over one of the true, heroes of religion, who studied at Union, who worked at Abyssinian, who had no truck with the more conservative evangelical tradition. I mean, he would never, that was not the one he was attracted to when he came to the United States. And yet there's people who are trying to take over his image and claim him as their own. What is your take on that film? And I haven't seen it. I don't know anything about it, but aside from that, it's controversial, just like Bonhoeffer's legacy is.
Yeah, and I have been following it, and part of it is that Eric Metaxas is one of the major actors in this, and he's definitely one of the leaders that I'm tracking. Eric Metaxas was kind of casting himself as a sort of public intellectual of American evangelicalism in the 2000s, early 2010s, and then he really has thrown in hard with Donald Trump. He was actually the MC at the big Jericho March. It was one of the preceding events leading up to January 6th. And he wrote a biography of Bonhoeffer, not well reviewed by scholars who actually study this stuff, but it was very popular. And a lot of people liked his approach to writing this biography. But now he's appropriated Bonhoeffer as a symbol and a tool of Christian nationalism, which is just one of the most disgusting bastardizations of a true theological hero. I mean, one of the things that Bonhoeffer, if you've actually read or studied Bonhoeffer, is famous for is his rejection of nationalism, his rejection of violence. Even when he did kind of participate in this plot to kill Hitler, he did not use theology to justify that. He was very, very ambivalent about finding any way to use theology to talk about violence. But instead, he renounced nationalism. Even some of the portrayals in, I have not seen the film yet. I think it's about to come out, but there's some of the images of showing Bonhoeffer holding a gun on some of the movie posters. He refused to hold weapons, right? And so there's this way, and some of the people, some of these Bonhoeffer scholars who have kind of organized these petitions and challenged this are friends of mine. And it is just a disgusting appropriation of a heroic figure, but then flipping the narrative and using him as a kind of tool of authoritarianism. It is really, really disgusting. And I think that those of us who care about theology, who know about Bonhoeffer, need to speak out in this moment and say that this is not accurate, and this is a real harmful utilization and an instrumentalization of a figure that we should actually be reading and caring for, and who guides us in the opposite direction.
Irony is dead. A figure who resisted fascism in Germany is being twisted into someone who might support Donald Trump I mean, come on now, people. Like, let's hold up a mirror to that. Anyway, listen. Dr. Matthew D. Taylor is senior scholar at the Institute for Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Studies, an expert on Christian nationalism and the New Apostolic Reformation. He's the author of The Violent Take It by Force, the Christian movement that is threatening our democracy. Wow. Matt, thank you so much for being with us here today. You are truly the bearer of bad news, and I never want to talk to you again except for all the time, because you also are so good at illuminating what is happening in a way that people can understand, and also that people just aren't aware of, because honestly, it's not getting through. What you're talking about is not getting through as a major message, and I really appreciate you, your scholarship, and you being with us here on The State of Belief.
Well, thank you for having me, Paul, and I really appreciate the work that you do as well.
Up next, Bad Faith, Christian nationalism's unholy war on democracy. I'll talk to the director and executive producer of this important new documentary. You can hear full episodes of The State of Belief anytime on our website at stateofbelief.com. You'll also find links to topics we discussed this week, as well as transcripts and more. And make sure you subscribe at stateofbelief.com/subscribe. You're listening to The State of Belief, where religion and democracy meet. Welcome back to The State of Belief. I'm Interfaith Alliance President, Reverend Paul Brandeis Raushenbush. The ongoing takeover of our democracy by Christian nationalists is a story so big, it takes a book or a documentary film to tell it. A brilliant and terrifying telling of this story can be seen in the recent documentary Bad Faith, Christian Nationalism's Unholy War on Democracy. It amplifies the wisdom and warnings of experts you've heard on The State of Belief, like Catherine Stewart, Jim Wallace, and Bishop William Barber, as well as many others. It's available right now on all the major streaming platforms, and I'm joined today by director Stephen Ujlaki, professor of screenwriting at Loyola Marymount University School of Film and Television, as well as executive producer Todd Stiefel, who is the founder and president of the Stiefel Free Thought Foundation. Stephen, Todd, welcome to The State of Belief.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great to be here.
So let's start with the election, this new reality. And I am curious, as you were in the lead up to the election and as the results were coming back in, what were you thinking in light of all of the work that you put into this important film? Let me start with you, Stephen.
Knowing from the research and making the film how powerful the Christian nationalist movement is and the Trumpist MAGA, knowing that, I have always been very, very skeptical that it was ever its strength was ever properly reported in polling, and I therefore there was a part of me that knew that there would have to be some major things going our way if Harris was going to win. And that didn't happen. When Musk came on, that was something that I think sealed it for Trump. So it's hugely disappointing. But of course the resistance now must take place, and the film is, I think, going to be really helpful in terms of educating people for the resistance, which is going to spring up after people are going to become aware of some of the things he's got planned for us. Right.
Todd, let me ask you the same question. You have invested so much of your time, your philanthropy in lifting up the danger of this movement and how it manifests, and how you must have seen how it was happening in the election. How have you been processing what happened in the election and in the weeks since?
That night was pretty brutal, to be honest, and the next day it was pretty tough to accept what was happening and transpiring. trying to remember about this in terms of the long arc of history. Christian nationalism in America, it's been going on since the founding. Since the Pilgrims arrived, this has been an issue, and it'll continue to be an issue. It's not going away. I think we need to focus on the long term here and mitigating damage over the next few years. But this is a long game. They see it as a long game, at least those who don't think they're going to be raptured next year during an apocalypse. But it's not over. And in some ways, there are silver linings to this cloud. Some of the things the Christian nationalists plan on doing are going to be truly horrific. And the silver lining to that is voters are going to get to see for themselves what we've been talking about for all these years. A lot of people, I think, don't want to hear it. People try to tune out some of the doom and gloom stuff, especially if they haven't seen it happen themselves. So, they're going to see it for themselves real soon. And that gives us an opportunity for, really making a difference in the next few elections.
One of the biggest disappointments of the film was realizing people's resistance to believing that these people actually believed this stuff and would implement it if they had the opportunity.
To build on that, I'd say, in particular, people in traditionally blue states, New York, California, etc. I mean, I've gone on fundraising trips with donors for secular organizations, and a lot of people don't realize they live in their own blue bubbles where they deal with the problems of the far left running the show rather than the far right. And I think a lot of people, especially big donors in like Silicon Valley and elsewhere, need to wake up to what's happening in the red states, and really need to be alert and aware of, like, you may not be seeing this in your day-to-day life in California, but people are seeing this throughout the South and the Midwest. Yeah. And we're about to see it at a national level in a way we haven't seen in 100 years.
We talk about blue states and red states, but I'll tell you, like, I live in one of the most progressive, I live in Chelsea in New York, and in my district, some, Moms for Liberty folks passed an anti-trans resolution before anybody could see it. It's happening everywhere. So let's talk about the film, because, it is a remarkable piece of work. When was the genesis? After 2016, or was it 2020? Yeah. It starts graphically with January 6th. If no one's talked to you about what's really going on in the more Christian nationalist movement, you miss why all the Jesus flags were there. And you miss why all of the prayer services were happening the day before, and even at the ellipse. When was the first time, let me ask you, Stephen, like, when was the first time that you had the aha moment? Somehow you must have been like, oh, maybe I can make a film about this. What was the genesis of that?
Well, the genesis was that, as I said, I was dean at the time Trump was elected. And so I couldn't really do anything, make a film. But 2 years later, I stepped down and began doing research about evangelicals. I mean, I knew that they had played a huge role. And that brought me into looking at the whole history of how this evolved with people like Weyrich and the extreme right and their long-time campaign to accomplish what they are now very close to accomplishing. And I initially... Then I discovered Christian nationalism. Then, of course, at that point, people said, no, it didn't really exist. Franklin Graham said it's just a fantasy of the left. They're just trying to make up something. My thesis initially when I started the film was saying, look, what? There's a possibility that this group will engage in violence to accomplish its goals. That was going to be what I was going to prove in the film, which I started researching on in 2018. By January 6th, it was like, okay, that was proven. Now, what was the film going to be about? What was the film going to be about? That was what I was trying to prove. Now it's there. So what's the next step? And then the realization that January 6th, for many of them, was like a very important key moment. It wasn't, again, the way liberals look at it, like this horrific thing that happened that had never happened before in the history of the country. No, this was like showing, look how powerful we are. Look what we can do. Look how fragile it is. And again, that's an example of two different countries looking at the same event through completely different eyes and not drawing the conclusions that they need to draw. And anyway, so at that point, I realized that the film was about explaining to people that the ability of this group to actually take over the country existed. Forget violence. Now was actually that they could actually take power in the country. And that became the goal of the film, to show that they had the potential, they had the money, they'd been planning for it for 40 some years. It was a distinct possibility.
Yeah. I think the thing that kind of blew my mind as I began to research, and it's in your film very prominently, is this idea of good versus evil, spiritual warfare, that it's all like, this is part of the Great War. And they are generals on the good side, and everyone else is demonic or satanic, or name your bad word in their lexicon. And I think in some ways, just as people were are we dealing with a Republican Party? Like, people still didn't realize, I think, over the last 8 years, that there was the Republican Party that we thought existed, even if we disagreed with it, no longer existed. And I think evangelicals, as we thought existed, who were like, well, I really want to, make decisions about gay marriage, and we're very conservative, they don't exist anymore either. There is no, and I'm not making excuse because it's not my tradition, but I think that everything now is being framed as your opponents are satanic in a spiritual war. That's a new level of danger, because that cannot exist in a democracy.
Right. There were so many things that we had to cut out of the film because it's already pretty dense. But when you realize, and we talk about it briefly in the film, when Weyrich and the evangelical leaders, Falwell and Robertson, made their deal, the issue was, wait a minute, okay, how am I going to deliver our parishioners to the Republican Party? Weyrich said it's easy, good versus evil. So they took this Manichaeism that is, a theological construct, the notion of good versus evil, and that's what goes on in the world, which is, part of their theology, part of different religions' philosophy, theology, unfortunately. And they applied that to the political sphere, which had never happened before. So all of a sudden you have not just an opponent, but it was done in order to make sure that these evangelicals understood why they had to vote for the Republican Party, because the Republican Party was a party of God. Like Hezbollah, the party of God, and the Democrats were the party of Satan. So that device to get them to do it ended up sticking and being used and now becoming basically gospel, if I may say, amongst these people. And that's one of the horrific things that came out of that business deal, basically.
Right. Todd, you come out of a particular tradition. I think for my friends who are not from a religious tradition, this is one of the most shocking elements of what is being revealed in films like Bad Faith about Christian nationalism. How does this land with you and involve you in this struggle?
I identify as an atheist. I was raised Catholic, but I frankly see it as part of a timeless battle between truth and misinformation, truth and dogma. It may be new in this country at this scale and during our lifetimes, but this has been playing out for tens of thousands of years. Good versus evil for your political opponents led to crusades, led to wars, led to inquisitions. This is as old as human history of misusing religion to persecute your enemies for political gain and labeling that good versus evil. And it's more of the classic divide and conquer isms that are used usually by dictators, where it's nationalism, it's the Chinese are good and the Japanese are evil, or vice versa. It's the Muslims are good, but the Christians are evil, and vice versa. And we're now seeing that as the Republicans are good and the Democrats are evil. But that's because the Republicans are the God party and the Democrats are the evil atheist party. Just like during the Red Scare, it was, oh, the
Right.
godless communists.
Ooh,
We got to
Right.
root them out of Hollywood. This is just another phase in a very long battle that is going to continue to happen. It's not going to go away, and people need to keep working on it, but recognize that like when we have a setback, that's because over the long arc of history, there's lots of setbacks,
right.
and we can help as individuals, and we can do a lot together with large numbers and money. But each individual, we can't take losing a presidential election as a defeat to ourselves. Like, there's only so much power I have. There's only so much power you have. We need groups of us, tons of us, to really affect change. And when we lose, it's the team that's losing. But a lot of times I think we take it personally, but there's only so much power I have or you have to affect change. Like I
Yeah.
can't decide the presidency.
Yeah.
It sometimes takes a defeat in order to mobilize, because the history is a dialectic. The country wasn't ready for the lesson today. Maybe it will be in 2 years or in 4 years when they've seen what this group that they think is relatively benign, when they see what they're going to do. And the other part of this is, to the extent that the extreme right has taken 40 plus years in their campaign, we have to actually have a campaign or a movement that is against Christian nationalism, that is against the introduction of religion into government, that is reminds people of the secular founding of this country.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
is a key thing that has to happen. We have to go back actually to that point, because they've created this whole mythology, but in fact, it was founded as a secular nation exactly to avoid the kind of religious wars that Europe had been
Yes.
going through and had lost millions of people for hundreds of years. And so now they're wanting to return to that.
Let me ask you, like, what were moments in the film where you're like, ah, I wish this could be on blast? Someone who said something that felt like this is the articulation of the thesis of this film. Who was there? Was there one individual? Were there a couple who you really remember as being almost startled when you heard what they were saying and saying, I wish everyone could hear this?
Yeah, absolutely. For me, the smoking gun was the Weyrich Manifesto that Ann Nelson mentions in her book, The Shadow Network. And I looked it up and I thought, my God, they've actually written this stuff down. They actually do plan to weaken and destroy democracy, because I never believed that I had the hardest time when I was making the film thinking that, gee, these people actually don't like democracy. They're against it. I couldn't imagine. I thought, wait, what? But that's the truth. They absolutely were against democracy. And this was the proof of what they tried to do, because they knew they would never be a majority. And they had to destroy democracy, because they would never get to power without it. And that to me is like the key part of the film. This is the reason people need to see the film, because they don't understand that these people are not just normally crazy and weird. They actually fully intend to destroy our democracy.
Right.
I agree with Steve that I was not aware of that document until I saw one of the early cuts of the film, and it was eye-opening, but I'll have to admit it wasn't like that surprising, having played in this space for so long. It was like, yeah, the seven mountains and take over government, education, etc. Like it was just a little bit, it was not a little, it was just a lot more right there out in the open. It's kind of like what happened then again with Project 2025. It's like we've known about these crazy ideas, and but to see them like just boldly putting them out there in public, usually they kind of keep them quiet or in their set. You'll see something leak out of one of their seminars, or right wing watch picks on something. But like they're just throwing it out there now. They're emboldened. They're just like, here you go. Here's the plan. We're going to disassemble huge parts of the government, and we're not just going to have the wolves in the hen house. We're going to have wolves in charge of the hen house.
I mean, one of the other things I realized in the making of the film is that I was witnessing a slow motion revolution, because initially they denied about Christian nationalism. Then they would say, yeah, we are, but it's really a good thing. But as Todd said, they kept carefully behind wraps what they really wanted to do, because they didn't think it was time. Then in the course of the last year or two, they thought, wait a minute, let's get out there with it. We're going to win. We're dominant. We're going to have a display of dominance, But before that, when people in churches were told that they want, about the idea of recreating God's kingdom on earth, people from the outside might have thought that that was like a theological point, a spiritual point, the spiritual kingdom of God. No, they were talking about a theocracy. They were talking about you, right. But you wouldn't know that if you were on the outside looking in. So all this stuff was very carefully covered up. And then it became now out in the open, and we're experiencing now, as they attempt to implement it. So there has been a feeling on their part that it's inevitable that they are going to win, and that their best tactic is to just flaunt it and scare people into submission. And a concern, of course, is that people are going to submit or going to give up. And so it's very important going forward that we make it clear that that's their strategy, and that we need to counter that.
I've been speaking with director Stephen Ujlaki and executive producer Todd Stiefel of their exceptional film, Bad Faith. Thank you both for being with us on The State of Belief.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
I'm sure you know someone who'd get a lot out of this conversation, so please share The State of Belief with them, and be sure to subscribe to The State of Belief at Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform. We need your help to keep making The State of Belief, so if you'd like to make a financial contribution, go to stateofbelief.com. That's stateofbelief.com. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of Religion News Service or Religion News Foundation. The State of Belief is produced by Ray Kirstein and is a production of Interfaith Alliance. Become a member today at interfaithalliance.org. And be sure to join us next week. I'll be in conversation with Yale historian Dr. Timothy Snyder, best-selling author of books like On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century, and more recently, On Freedom. I can't wait. Until then, I'm Paul Brandeis Raushenbush on The State of Belief, where religion and democracy meet.